Disclaimer: this program contains graphic descriptions of real crimes. Viewer discretion is advised. All parties are presumed innocent until proven guilty in court. Mom poisoned her kid's breakfast for revenge against husband. A child's laughter at the breakfast table is one of the purest sounds in the world. It's supposed to mean safety, warmth, and love. But what happens when the very person meant to protect that innocence turns it into a weapon? That Saturday morning started like any other. 2 children rubbing sleep from their eyes, a kitchen filled with the smell of pancakes, and a mother who smiled as she poured their juice. Yet hidden inside that routine was a secret so dark it would send an entire town into shock. Because this time, the danger didn't come from outside the home, it was already sitting at the table. The first sign was not the taste. 10-year-old Ava said the orange juice was weird, sweet, but she kept drinking because she'd been taught to finish what she started. 7-year-old Micah didn't notice anything at all. He was busy building a syrup volcano, humming the theme from the show he wasn't allowed to watch during meals. Their mother, Leela, watched from the counter. Her face looked like it had been wiped clean with something too harsh. She had the look of someone who'd burned her tongue 2 days ago and still hasn't tasted right since. "Slow down," she said, voice careful. "We're not in a race." No one was racing. Time was 10 minutes later. The nausea hit. Micah pressed both hands to his stomach and leaned against the back of his chair. Ava winced, color draining. "I don't feel right," she whispered. Leela's phone buzzed. She didn't look at it, not yet, not when something in her had already started to scream. The emergency room lights were bright in the kind way, the way meant to keep panic from slipping into shadows. Ava's breath rattled, then steadied. Micah cried once, a thin sound like glass singing, and then he was quiet because quiet was what everyone needed. Nurses moved quickly. An attending physician asked simple questions very softly, like he might spook the answers if he raised his voice. Lab orders flew. Roman 4s went in. The world narrowed to beeping and the taste of metal. If you asked Leela later what those hours felt like, she would tell you she can't remember, that it was a hole in the tape, a section burned blank. But memory has edges. It catches on things, the buzz of the phone, again and again. The detective standing in the doorway with his notebook held low, as though lowering it meant he wasn't really writing down the truth. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "we're going to need to ask about breakfast." The town Leela lived in liked to call itself charming. There were string lights over the main street and a cafe where the owner knew how everyone took their coffee. But charm is a coat, not the weather. Underneath, lives can be raw and unseasonable. Leela had been a good mother in the way people measure good appointments kept, birthday cakes baked, permission slips signed before they were due. She coached Ava's league basketball team and taped spelling words to the refrigerator. She drove a hatchback that smelled like applesauce and crayons and something citrus she used to clean the seats. Her husband, Daniel, worked in construction management. He was a big laugh in small rooms, a Saturday morning pancake flipper, a decent guy who forgot the milk half the time, and then he wasn't. There was an affair that bloomed quietly at first, like mold under a sink. Secrets like damp. Then there were fights, doors shut too hard, words flung like crockery. After the separation, a custody schedule was etched onto the calendar with dull certainty. Tuesdays and Thursdays, alternating weekends, the brittle fairness of court orders overtaking what used to be a life. The judge's signature turned Leela's home into coordinates, her children into time slots. And somewhere between those black lines, on a night when she fell asleep fully clothed on the couch because the bed felt like a stage where she had to pretend to be okay, something in her slipped. Rage is heavy. It asks to be put down, but if you carry it long enough, It starts to sound reasonable. It says, "They did this to you. Don't you want the world to understand? Friends saw it and didn't see it." She stopped answering group texts. She smiled too large for pictures. She said she wasn't hungry and chewed gum to deaden the taste of every day. When she looked at Daniel in the parking lot handoff, her smile had angles. He set Micah's backpack in her trunk and held her gaze a second too long, as though waiting for the apology that never came. The week before everything exploded, Leela sat in her car outside the grocery store, air conditioning on full, hands pinned to the wheel, and thought, what would make him hurt? The way I hurt, not the honest hurt of loss, the other kind, the kind that wants to swallow everybody. The idea arrived like a whisper behind her ear. She could scare him. She could break his heart with the most powerful hammer in the world. Risk to the children he loved more than breath. Not to kill, she told herself that, never that, just to frighten, to jolt, to make him crawl. This is where everyone wants a clear line, good mother/bad mother, but the truth is messier. There were 1,000 exits off that thought. She passed them all, one by one, because anger lit the wrong part of the map. The day began ordinary on purpose. That was part of the plan. Routine would camouflage the wrongness. She lined up the plates. Pancake savas with a smiley face, Micah's in a lopsided stack, juice in the good glasses. She told herself she would control it, just a little, enough to light a fire under Daniel, enough to make the sirens arrive. She didn't think about the silence that would follow the sirens. People never think about the after silence. What exactly happened in the kitchen? There are details that don't belong in stories. They help no one. It's enough to say that Leela introduced harm into the breakfast where no harm belonged. It's enough to say that the ingredients of a childhood morning were suddenly dangerous because someone who should have been their shield turned her body into a bridge for her own rage. When Micah and Ava took their first sips, Leela saw the future in one long blink. Daniel at the hospital, gray, face shattered, her in tears, playing the part she hadn't rehearsed but felt born to perform. Later, she told herself she'd undo it, call 911 immediately, explain away the dizziness as food poisoning, point a trembling finger at a tainted bottle, and then at the store. Everyone would blame the factory, the barcode, the faceless supply chain. She'd be the heroine who caught it in time. Daniel would fall apart and reach for her hand, but the future doesn't care about your script. Within minutes, the kids were sick, too sick. The look on Micah's face, prize curdled into fear, or a hole in all her rationalizations. Ava's fingers trembled. "Mom," she said, a question shaped like trust. Leela snapped back into the person she used to be. She called 911. She told them everything they needed to hear to move fast. Sirens came. Paramedics' voices were brisk and kind. A neighbor peered over the hedge, frozen. Leela rode to the hospital with her children, her hands pressed to their hair, repeating a single sentence over and over like an incantation. "You're okay, you're okay, you're okay." She did not believe herself. She said it anyway. When detectives walk into a pediatric ward, their faces rearrange themselves. They try to soften. They try to tuck their questions under blankets. But questions have edges. Detective Rowan was in his 50s with the kind of eyes that have seen too much and decided to keep looking anyway. He sat beside Leela and asked for the timeline. "What time did you start breakfast? What exactly did they eat? Did either child complain about the taste? Did you drink or eat any of it yourself? Were there any recent illnesses? Any medications in the house? Any reason to believe someone would want to hurt your family?" Layla's answers were neat, like stamped envelopes. She'd been neat all her life. She said there were no enemies. She said she hadn't noticed anything strange. She said she hadn't eaten because she'd been nauseous. Rowan noted everything. He also noted the way she kept looking at the hallway, as though the truth were stuck there, catching its breath. Back at the house, a forensic team swept through. The kitchen smelled like citrus and maple. The sink gleamed, too gleaming, the tech muttered. A trash bag sat by the back door, new and empty, like it had been swapped out recently. On the counter, a dish of pancakes had gone cold, the smiley face on Ava's first one collapsing into a grimace. They would find enough, they always do, an empty container rinsed but not well enough, trace residues that don't care how hard you scrub, a purchase that lived inside a bank statement and then in a browser history. The internet keeps every sin you whisper into it at 2 a.m. as long as you type, but the key wasn't only the traces. It was the text messages on Daniel's phone, a thread of anger so hot it stained the screen, ending with something Leela had sent the night before. 6 words hissed through a clenched jaw. You don't deserve what you love. Does she have a lawyer? Someone asked in a quiet voice. In the hospital, Rowan returned to Leela with an offer disguised as a lifeline. Things happen, he said. People get lost. If there's anything you need to tell me now before this rolls downhill and crushes you. Leela stared at the Roman 4 tape on Ava's arm. She thought of first days of school, of shoelaces and scraped knees and the tiny scars on Micah's shins from falling off his scooter. She thought of how revenge had dressed itself up as a mother's power and how she'd bought the costume with cash she didn't have. Something broke. She started to talk. Not everything, not in a straight line, but enough to put her in the handcuffs that felt more like the end of falling than the beginning of being held. Courtrooms sand down a person's life and stack the boards into a narrative. The prosecution's version was simple. Leela Hargrove, in a calculated act of revenge against her estranged husband, intentionally tainted her children's breakfast with a harmful substance, causing them severe illness. Motive, spite, method, deliberate, outcome, nearly catastrophic. The defense tried to braid compassion and chaos. They described a woman ground down by betrayal, trapped in a spiral of sleep deprivation, anxiety, and postpartum echoes that had never properly faded. They said she intended to stage a scare, a medical emergency without lasting harm, to shake Daniel, to force him to see her pain. They said she called 911 immediately. That she stayed, that she wept, that she cooperated. No one disputed the children mattered to her. That might be the most brutal part. A pediatric toxicologist testified without drama. He said the children would recover, no permanent damage. They were lucky. He did not use the word miracle, but it flickered in the linoleum between his shoes. Daniel testified too. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 3 months. When asked whether he believed Leela planned to kill their children, he shook his head and made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. Leela loved them, he said. Choking, she loves them, I know that. That's what makes this. I don't have words. The courtroom air changed when a caseworker spoke about the custody calendar, about pick-up times, and the way parents can become clocks that resent their own ticking. People shifted in their seats, remembering arguments in their own kitchens that never led to headlines but left dents in the drywall of the heart. The twist, the part that tightened everyone's throat, came when the prosecution revealed a piece of timing almost too cruel to bear. Saturday mornings, they said, had once been pancake mornings for the entire family. Even after the separation, Daniel often stopped by to make a batch and eat with the kids, a fragile ritual they hadn't figured out how to end. The morning of the incident, he had texted at 6:04 a.m., running a job, site inspection, won't make breakfast, kiss them for me. The toxicologist had already testified that the harmful substance would have affected any adult at the table, likely with greater intensity due to portion size. The inference was a blade. Whatever Leela thought she was arranging, a scare for Daniel, had veered at the last second into a nightmare she had not foreseen. Her plan was a boomerang. She threw it. It came back with the wrong names carved into it. Leela put her face in her hands and cried, not stage crying, but the kind of weeping that sounds like a person being peeled. Intent is everything in court. It is also a shadow, puppet, real shape, distorted size. The jury had to decide whether Leela meant to harm or only to terrify. They held the children's hospital bracelets in their minds and weighed them against the emergency call, the quick confession, the lack of prior abuse. In the end, their verdict threaded a needle that no one wanted to thread. Guilty of child endangerment and assault, not guilty of attempted murder, the sentence was years, the kind that sound shorter on paper than they are inside a day. There would be mandated treatment, ironclad restraining orders, a geography of supervised visitation that might never loosen. No one clapped. These are not stories that end with applause. Healing is not an arc. It's a labyrinth where you double back and touch the same walls twice to make sure they're real. Ava had nightmares at first, and then fewer of them. She began to sleep with the door cracked wider. Micah stopped humming at the table and then started again on a Tuesday in April while he was eating blueberries. Daniel cried once while putting away groceries because the orange juice was on sale and he didn't know if he should buy it. People were kind, mostly. Meals were dropped off. Rides were offered. The town that called itself charming did what it could. But there were also whispers in the cereal aisle, sideways glances at the park. The story had moved through them like weather and left branches everywhere. In prison, Leela completed counseling programs with religious attention to homework. She wrote letters she wasn't allowed to send. She learned the slow work of accountability, which is not only saying, I did this, but I see what I did, not just as a series of events, but as a map of harm that shows how pain travels outward in rings like a stone thrown into water. She said to her counselor, I wanted him to feel it, and then, a month later, I made them feel it instead. And the counselor nodded because that is the hinge on which everything turns. When the supervised visits began, they were in a room painted a bright, insistently cheerful yellow. A caseworker sat in the corner with a clipboard she pretended not to have. Ava brought a book she didn't read from. Micah lined up toy cars and pushed them gently across the rug one by one. Leela's hands trembled so hard the first time that she had to sit on them. No one talked about breakfast. They talked about school. They talked about soccer cleats and handwriting, and whether the tooth fairy had remembered this time. Love does not erase what happened. It just refuses to let the worst thing be the only thing. Daniel lived like someone balancing crystal on a moving train. He made checklists. He attended parent groups he never would have set foot in before. He learned how to sit quietly when the kids were quiet and not fill the space with promises he couldn't keep. He kept a framed photo on the hallway table of a time before any of this, not because he wanted to go back. He didn't, but because memory can be a bridge when it isn't being a trap. He did not forgive Leela quickly. Forgiveness is a muscle, not a switch, but he refused to make their children carry his anger. That was a gift he gave them in 100 small ways no one put in a headline. A soft tone at bedtime, an extra 5 minutes on the curb before school when Micah didn't want to get out of the car, a joke about broccoli, the decision to put the orange juice back on the grocery list. People love to say, I would never. The truth is, most of us will never be asked to prove it. Revenge wears 1,000 faces. Some are petty and forgettable. Some climb onto kitchen counters and reach for the cup you set too close to the edge. The seduction of it is the story it tells you about yourself. that you are the hero correcting the scales the world knocked crooked. It is a lie with excellent lighting. If this story has a moral, it is not be better. That's too vague. Try this instead. When hurt starts to sound like reason, pull the fire alarm. Call a friend, walk around the block, eat something salty, cry into a towel. Tell the truth in a room where the truth can't go anywhere dangerous. If you cannot find that room, keep looking. Someone has it. They will open the door. When people asked Detective Rowan what he thought, he said the same thing each time. I think those kids were incredibly lucky, and that luck is not a plan. He said, I think grief and anger can turn smart people into bad decision factories. And I think the line between hurting and hurting back is thinner than we want it to be. That's why we build guardrails. That's why we ask for help before we're the worst version of ourselves. He kept a photograph from the case in his desk, 2 paper bracelets with children's names, looped around a nurse's pen for the camera. He looked at it on the days when the job felt like a tide that wouldn't stop coming. On the back, in neat handwriting, he'd written, saved, not because he believed in easy endings, but because some words need to be said out loud in a world where the quiet can be dangerous. A year later, on a morning that smelled like wet sidewalks and cut grass, Daniel woke before the kids. He made pancakes. He set out plates and poured juice and checked the expiration date twice because rituals matter. He waited, Ava padded in, hair a storm cloud, eyes cautious and hopeful at the same time. Micah followed, dragging his blanket. They sat, they ate. No one said, remember. No one said, never again. The miracle was that no one had to. Normal is not the absence of fear. It's the willingness to sit at the table anyway. Cartoons. Micah asked, not quite meeting his father's eyes, testing the old boundary like a door he hoped was still there. After, Daniel said, smiling, eat first. He poured syrup. He refilled a glass. He listened to his children talk about a class pet with a name too ridiculous to repeat. He thought about guardrails and second chances and the way the world can split and then, if you hold very still and keep breathing, knit itself back together with seams you only see when the light hits just right. Breakfast is supposed to be safe. On this morning it was, and that mattered more than anything anyone could say about revenge. The image of a mother in handcuffs, still in the same sweatshirt she wore when she dialed 911s, spread like wildfire. Neighbors who once waved across driveways shook their heads in disbelief. Local news anchors leaned hard on words like revenge, betrayal, and unspeakable, but the truth was quieter and more complicated. In the days following her arrest, the town didn't just mourn for the children. They mourned for the collapse of the picture, perfect family they thought they knew. Ava and Micah survived. Doctors called it a narrow escape. Their recovery was slow, nausea, lingering weakness, and a cloud of confusion. Ava kept asking questions no adult could answer. Why would Mom do that? Was I bad? Can we ever eat pancakes again? Micah said less. He clutched a stuffed dinosaur through every hospital checkup. His silence was louder than his sister's questions. Daniel sat beside them day and night. He never let go of their hands, even when exhaustion pulled him into uneasy sleep. Every beep. The monitor was a reminder of how close he had come to burying his children. By the time the trial began, prosecutors had built a devastating narrative. They painted Leela as a woman consumed by jealousy and rage, willing to weaponize breakfast against the people she claimed to love. They pointed to her late-night internet searches, the container rinsed but not clean enough, and the angry text, "You don't deserve what you love." They told the jury that this was not an accident. It was an act of calculated vengeance meant to shatter Daniel by destroying what mattered most to him. Her defense attorney told another story. He spoke of a woman unraveling under betrayal, of mental illness left untreated, of postpartum scars that had never healed. He reminded the jury that she called 911 herself, that she stayed with the children, that she confessed without a lawyer present. She did not want her children to die, he said, voice low. She wanted her husband to understand her pain. That is not an excuse, but it is context. When Daniel took the stand, the courtroom still. His voice cracked as he described the moment he got the call, the sight of his children strapped to hospital gurneys, their faces pale, Roman fours running into their arms. Then came the question, did he believe Leela had intended to kill their children? He closed his eyes, breathing heavily. When he finally answered, his voice was almost a whisper. No, she loved them. That's what makes this so unbearable. The most haunting detail came when prosecutors revealed Daniel's early morning text. He had been scheduled to join breakfast that day, just as he had dozens of Saturdays before. But work pulled him away at the last second. If he had sat at that table, experts testified, the dose meant for him might have killed him instantly. The jury didn't need reminding. What began as revenge against a husband had nearly ended as the death of 2 children. After days of testimony and sleepless deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty of child endangerment, guilty of assault, not guilty of attempted murder. The sentence, several years in prison, mandatory counseling, and a lifetime of restricted contact with her children. No one cheered. There were no winners, only survivors. As Leela was led away, Ava and Micah clung to their father's hands. The world outside the courthouse snapped pictures, eager to package the pain into headlines. But inside that family, the real story was just beginning. How to rebuild trust when trust has been shattered. How to eat breakfast again without fear. And how to live when the person who was supposed to love you most became the source of your nightmares. Because some betrayals don't just break hearts, they poison entire families. Recovery wasn't just about Roman 4 drips and cleared medical charts. Ava and Micah carried invisible wounds that medicine couldn't reach. At school, Ava stopped raising her hand in class. She had once been a bubbly, eager student, always first to volunteer for spelling bees, but now she shrank into herself. Her teachers noticed she'd push food around her plate during lunch. Pancakes, especially, made her stomach turn. Micah, just 7, developed night terrors. He'd wake up screaming, clutching his throat as if he were choking all over again. Daniel would rush into his room, holding him until the shaking stopped, whispering over and over, "You're safe now." Daddy's here, but the truth, safety, had become a fragile word. Daniel's world shrank to 2 priorities, protect his children and try to keep them whole. He quit late shifts, turned down promotions, and became the parent who packed lunches, braided hair, and waited in carpool lines. The divorce had already broken him, but what Leela did had carved a deeper wound. Still, he refused to let bitterness rule. He told himself, if I carry my hate, my children will carry it too. So he smiled when he was exhausted. He laughed at Micah's jokes even when they made no sense. He showed up for every game, every school event, even when work begged him to miss. He had to be both mother and father now, even as the shadow of betrayal hovered over them. Prison stripped Leela of the illusion that she had been in control. Gone were the routines of motherhood, replaced by iron doors and rigid schedules. She spent her first months replaying that morning over and over, asking herself why she didn't stop, why she didn't choose another way to scream her pain. In therapy sessions, she admitted something chilling. I didn't want to kill them, but in that moment, I wanted him to suffer more than I wanted them to be safe. Counselors called it misplaced rage. The law called it a crime. Her children would forever call it betrayal. She wrote letters she wasn't allowed to send. Apologies scrawled in shaky handwriting. I love you. I failed you. I'm sorry. The pages piled up in a folder she kept beneath her mattress. The town was torn. Some branded Leela a monster. Others whispered, She was a broken woman, pushed past her limits. Parents at school kept their distance from Daniel, not out of cruelty, but out of discomfort. How do you look a man in the eye when his children nearly died in the one place they should have been safest? The story lingered in grocery aisles and church pews. People couldn't stop asking themselves the question they were too ashamed to say out loud. Could I ever snap like that? Months later, supervised visitation was granted. The visits took place in a brightly painted yellow room inside the correctional facility. Toys, board games, and a staff caseworker filled the space. The first time Ava and Micah walked in, their steps faltered. Leela sat waiting, her hands trembling in her lap. She looked smaller, as if prison walls had compressed her. "Hi, babies," she whispered, voice breaking. Ava crossed her arms, her face hard. Micah hid behind Daniel's leg, peeking out with wide, fearful eyes. The visit was short, awkward, and filled with silence. Ava refused to touch the juice box offered her. Micah pushed cars across the rug without looking up. When the hour was over, Leela cried quietly into her hands as the guard led her away. Healing is not a straight path. It's a circle, one that brings you back to the same painful places until you learn how to step past them. Daniel knew the road would be long. He knew therapy sessions would stretch into years. He knew birthdays and holidays would always carry shadows. But he also knew this: the children were alive. That was the miracle he clung to. Because in the end, Ava and Micah weren't just victims of their mother's revenge. They were survivors, and survival meant possibility. The courtroom had passed its judgment. Prison walls held Leela, but for Daniel and the children, the real sentence was life after betrayal. Every morning at the breakfast table, the unspoken memory lingered. The clink of spoons against bowls, the pour of orange juice, the sweetness of syrup, all reminders of the day breakfast became a weapon. But survival meant sitting at that table anyway. Survival meant eating, laughing, and building a future out of fractured trust. Because for this family, the story wasn't about death. It was about learning how to live again after betrayal poisoned the first meal of the day. Prison did not silence Leela's mind. If anything, it turned up the volume. At night, she lay awake replaying the same scene. Ava's trembling fingers, Micah's wide eyes, the sound of her own voice insisting, "You're okay, you're okay." When she knew they weren't, her cellmates avoided her, not because she was violent, but because the word children clung to her charges. Even in prison, some crimes carry a heavier stench. Mothers who harm their own are placed in a category beyond theft, beyond fraud, beyond even murder. Isolation ate at her, guilt gnawed at her ribs like a slow fire. She began attending group therapy, where other women shared stories of loss and regret. Some spoke of addiction, others of violence. But when it was her turn, Leela struggled to speak. Finally, one day, she whispered, "I love them more than anything. And still, I let hate for him matter more than love for them." The room went silent. No one offered comfort. Some wounds are too raw to wrap in words. Leela continued to write letters, page after page, apology after apology. "Ava, you were always my brave one. Micah, my sunshine boy. I never wanted to hurt you. I wanted to hurt him, but I see now. I hurt all of us." She stacked them neatly in a folder. Counselors urged her to stop, to focus on her own healing first. But she insisted, "If I stop writing, I stop hoping." The letters became her ritual, her only tether to the children she might never truly hold again outside those prison walls. Daniel was learning to live a double life. To the children, he tried to be steady, reliable, the parent who never faltered. But when the house was quiet, he let himself break. He'd sit at the kitchen table long after Ava and Micah were asleep, staring at the same spot where Leela once poured their juice. His fists clenched, unclenched, his chest tightened with rage he refused to show. There were nights he wanted to curse her name, scream until the walls cracked, but he couldn't, not in front of the children. They had already seen enough. fractures, so he bottled his anger and poured it into parenting. Therapy sessions, school drop-offs, pancake Saturdays, this time carefully supervised, with nothing left to chance. At 11, Ava's innocence had been stolen by betrayal. She became fiercely protective of her brother, watching over him. Like a parent, she no longer trusted easily. Even teachers noticed it, the way she scanned adults with wary eyes, as though waiting for the next person who was supposed to care for her to let her down. But she also carried strength beyond her years. When Micah had nightmares, it was often Ava who climbed into his bed, whispering, "It's okay, I'm here." She was learning a lesson no child should. Sometimes safety doesn't come from parents. Sometimes it comes from siblings. Micah was different, younger. Softer, he still asked questions Daniel dreaded. Does Mom still love us? Will she come home? Was I bad that day? Each time, Daniel crouched to meet his eyes, speaking with a gentleness he barely had the energy to muster. You were never bad. She loves you. But what she did was wrong. Micah clung to those words. He needed to believe love still lived on the other side of betrayal, even if trust never would. And the years passed. Prison wore Leela down. The therapy helped, but only up to a point. The truth pressed harder each day. She had nearly killed the only people who loved her unconditionally. One night, guards found her sobbing on the cell floor, clutching her stack of letters. I broke them, she whispered over and over. I broke them, I broke them. Psychologists labeled it a breakdown. Leela called it clarity. She no longer asked herself how she got there. She knew. The bigger question was whether her children would ever look at her without fear again. Back home, Daniel created a rhythm. Therapy every Wednesday, movie nights every Friday, pancake breakfasts every Saturday morning. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes Ava pushed her plate away. Sometimes Micah woke screaming. Sometimes Daniel cried in the bathroom so they wouldn't see. But slowly, painfully, laughter began to return. Tentative at first, then louder. Micah giggled at cartoons again. Ava smiled when she scored her first goal in soccer. The house was healing, not because the past was forgotten, but because they had chosen to keep living in spite of it. For Leela, prison was walls and silence. For Daniel and the children, healing was noise. The noise of games, laughter, and life continuing forward. But beneath both stories was the same haunting truth. One breakfast had poisoned more than orange juice. It had poisoned trust, safety, and innocence. And though the body can heal, the heart remembers. The question that lingered was this: could forgiveness ever grow in soil poisoned by betrayal? Time did what it always does. It moved forward, even when no one was ready. Ava was now a teenager, her once childlike eyes sharpened by experiences most of her peers couldn't imagine. Micah, no longer a little boy, was entering middle school, quieter but wiser than children his age should be. Daniel had built a fragile sense of normalcy. Therapy had helped the children slowly reclaim pieces of their stolen childhood. Those scars still lingered. They laughed more, but there were shadows in there. Joy shadows that showed themselves in moments of silence, or in the way Ava flinched when she saw orange juice on the breakfast table. And then came the letter, a notice that Leela would be eligible for parole. The parole board gathered in a stark, wood-paneled room. Leela, thinner, with streaks of gray in her hair, sat in a plain jumpsuit, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She had spent years in therapy, completing every program offered to her. She spoke with a calm that seemed rehearsed, but was laced with desperation. I can't undo what I did, she said, her voice trembling. But I've faced the truth of it every day. I hurt the people I love most. If I'm ever given the chance, I want to prove I can be different, for my children, if they'll let me, and for myself. The board listened, stony-faced. Some leaned toward leniency. Others felt the weight of her crime still demanded punishment. And then came the most pivotal part, victim statements. Now 14, Ava sat beside her father, her heart pounding as she faced the board. She had practiced her words for weeks, but when she opened her mouth, tears blurred the page. "My mom was supposed to protect me," she began. But that day, I learned that the person you trust the most can hurt you the worst. I still have nightmares. I still feel scared at breakfast sometimes. But I also remember when my mom used to braid my hair, when she held my hand walking to school. I don't know if I can forgive her yet, but I don't want to hate her forever. The room fell silent. Ava's statement wasn't just testimony. It was the voice of a child standing between love and betrayal, torn but unbroken. Micah, younger and more hesitant, spoke softly, his words like fragile glass. "I love my mom," he whispered. "I know she hurt us, but I don't want her to be gone forever. I want her to get better. I want her to say sorry to my face, not just in letters." The board members scribbled notes. Daniel, sitting between them, squeezed both children's hands. His heart ached with pride and grief all at once. When it was his turn, Daniel's voice was steady, though his hands trembled. "I've had to raise my children alone because of what she did. I've had to see them wake from nightmares, afraid of their own mother. I cannot excuse her actions, but I also cannot deny that she has tried to change. The question is whether my children are safe. That is all that matters. Their safety, their peace of mind must come first." After hours of deliberation, the board granted Leela parole, but with strict conditions, mandatory counseling, no unsupervised contact with the children, and close monitoring for years. It was not freedom, not really. It was a cautious second chance. Weeks later, in a monitored family center, Leela saw her children for the first time in years outside prison walls. She looked older, smaller, and more fragile than they remembered. Ava stood stiffly, arms crossed. Micah hesitated, then took a step forward. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. Leela's tears spilled instantly. "Hi, baby. Hi, sweetheart." Ava didn't hug her, not yet, but she didn't walk away either. And in that moment, that was enough. Forgiveness is not a single act. It is a long, uneven road filled with starts and stops. Ava and Micah weren't ready to hand it over easily, and Daniel wasn't ready to trust again. But the parole hearing, the statements, and that first tentative meeting planted something fragile in the soil of their fractured family. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but possibility. And sometimes possibility is the bravest beginning of all. After parole, Leela entered a halfway house. The conditions were strict: mandatory therapy, monitored movements, and supervised family interactions. She was no longer the woman who walked freely into a kitchen and poured orange juice without consequence. Every action was watched, measured. Still, for the first time in years, she could step into sunlight without iron bars in her view. Her children, now older, agreed to see her, but only under supervision. Ava was cautious, arms folded, her teenaged face a mixture of defiance and lingering hurt. Micah was softer, holding on to hope that the mother he remembered still lived somewhere inside the woman in front of him. At one of their supervised meetings, Ava asked a question that cut through the air like glass. "Why, Mom, why did you do it?" Leela's lips trembled. For years, she had rehearsed apologies, explanations, excuses. But standing in front of her daughter's sharp, demanding eyes, she realized there was only one truth worth speaking. "Because I let my anger matter more than my love." And that was wrong. It was the worst thing I could have done. I can't ask you to forgive me. I can only ask you to see that I am trying to change. Ava didn't respond, but for the first time she didn't look away. For Daniel, the hardest part wasn't seeing Leela. It was deciding how much space she should occupy in the children's lives. He feared that allowing her too close would undo years of fragile healing, but he also feared that keeping her too far would rob the children of something they still longed for, the hope that their mother could be more than the worst choice she ever made. So he walked a narrow line. He attended every visit, monitored every word, and watched his children's faces closely for signs of pain. Trusting her again was impossible, but giving his children the chance to choose for themselves, that was the gift he could offer. Outside of visits, Leela lived with constant reminders of her crime. Other parolees avoided her. Employers hesitated, even at church. Whispers followed her down the pews, but she clung to therapy, to counseling, to the stack of letters she had once written from her cell. She showed them to her children eventually, not to ask for pity, but to prove that even in her darkest days she had thought of them. Some letters made Ava cry. Some made Micah smile. All of them reminded Daniel of the thin line between regret and redemption. 2 years after her parole, something unexpected happened. It was Ava's 16th birthday. She invited friends, laughter filled the house, and for the first time in a long time, the shadow of betrayal felt lighter. At the end of the night, Ava quietly approached Daniel. "Dad," she said, "I want Mom to come next year. I don't know if I'll ever forgive her, but I don't want to spend my whole life hating her either." Daniel swallowed hard. His chest ached at the thought. But when he looked at his daughter, standing tall, asking for her own voice in the story, he realized this was no longer just his choice. Forgiveness didn't come all at once. It came in fragments: a shared laugh, a letter read aloud, a hug that lasted longer than expected. For Ava and Micah, forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about refusing to let betrayal be the only definition of their family. For Daniel, forgiveness was about letting go of the fear that tomorrow would be a repeat of yesterday. And for Leela, forgiveness was about proving, day after day, that she could love without hurting. The shadow of that poisoned breakfast never disappeared, but in time it grew smaller, eclipsed by something stronger: resilience. Because while betrayal had nearly destroyed them, survival gave them something more powerful than revenge or regret: the chance to keep writing their story one morning at a time. And in the quiet of a kitchen where pancakes were once feared, laughter eventually returned. Not perfect, not whole, but alive.